from the Sun Yat-sen University in China on leave from John Jay College. He has taught Marxist political economy in China and the US, and he is on the editorial boards of Science and Society and the Journal of Labor and Society. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, in this very historical building, to participate in this very important meeting commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. Again, thanks to Ms. Yanthi Fernando. I also greatly enjoyed listening to Professor Chandrasekhar and the comments by Dr. Aziz Fong and Dr. Fao Sao. Let me first mention one thing, that since we're talking about the Bandung Conference, the Bandung Declaration, if you have a packet, information packet, which has the 10 points of the Bandung Conference, if you read it, I think the natural reaction is, well, it's nothing. I mean, it's very general. The Bandung Conference produced a rather generic document where it more or less reproduces the United Nations charters that countries agreed to in 1945. So in that way, we have to understand the Bandung Conference as a very important one, a very progressive conference, yet at the same time, it was also conservative in its nature. It didn't say much. It didn't make much big comments, projections on what will happen to the world. Nothing. And there's a good reason for that. When I say that it's great to be here in Colombo, it directly, I was talking about the 1954 Colombo Power Conference here, right here in this city, where the leadership from 5 countries, from Sri Lanka, obviously, from Burma or Myanmar, from India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. The leaders of the 5 countries got together in this city, and they discussed what shall be the way forward. One of the things out of the discussion was a preparation for a major conference a year later in 1955. So this was the place where the Bandung Conference was conceived, was prepared for. Now, as you can imagine, all those 5 countries had many, many differences. There were many conflicts, territorial claim conflicts, ideological differences, even among those 5 countries. None of them was ruled by a communist party. Nonetheless, they had important differences. And if you add China, obviously, after the Chinese Revolution, it was under a very different ideology. So it was very hard for the 29 countries gathering in Bandung, in Indonesia, to talk about a lot of issues. And this was the reason why those leaders eventually arrived at such a document which really didn't say much. But that itself is significant. The very fact that they can get together, they sit together, and as the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai at the time said, we representing China, we come here not to make arguments, we are trying to make friends. And that is the spirit of the Bandung Conference. We try to find common grounds. At the same time, we maintain our differences. Otherwise, we will be divided and conquered by Western powers who were at the time watching the conference very closely. So I think in that sense, we should realize that it's very difficult to do such a conference, even in the 1950s. And it was not in any way necessarily easier than today. to think about this. I mean, at the time, people were worrying about the coming World War III in the 1950s. And now, obviously, we have some similar worries, but it's not necessarily harder or easier. Let me also mention the next thing. At the time of the conference, the leadership broadly divided the countries into two groups. One is the so-called nationalist group, led by national bourgeoisie, independent movements, and the other was socialist group, which had a more radical program. Something that Professor Chandrasekhar today mentioned, said, if the new government, if the new independent government didn't have the political momentum, didn't have the courage, didn't have the support to carry out radical reforms such as land reform, they will face a small internal market. That is very true. But let me add that for countries like China, where we have nationwide massive land reform, was very successful. So the internal market in that sense was there. But because of the radicalness, because of the revolutionary moments, it was blocked by the entire Western camp. China suffered sanctions, blockade from the West, Paris Committee. It was the containment policy or containment strategy, targeting all those countries affiliated with communist movements. And Cuba today still faces such a very cruel blockade. The consequence of such blockade is transparent. We know how bad it is. And in China, we have a saying that we are tightening our belt to build socialism. In other words, there will be sacrifices. And the Chinese people made huge sacrifices. Even so, even with a robust domestic market, because of the blockade, China didn't have access to advanced technologies from the West. At the time, we know who is advanced. It was the US and Western Europe. And you don't have access to those, you have a very huge disadvantage in making progress. And also, even in terms of market, the US, the West, was a major market for the entire world. So for the Belt countries, even if they're thinking about something different, we want to do something different. We want to have our independent development, which is very different from the colonial model. In reality, they have to still make businesses with the Western powers. Even with those very companies, the very people who have been abusing our countries for centuries, we still have to do business with them. I mean, that's the cruel part of history. And the nationalist countries, under a nationalist government, they have somewhat access to Western technology, Western markets, but they didn't have internal markets. The socialist countries had internal markets, but they were blocked away, prevented from the Western tech and Western markets. So all those countries face some deep, deep challenges. And eventually, we know from the late 1970s, all the countries started to move towards a different direction, a direction that dismisses national development. Rather, it advocates for some kind of globalization. Obviously, that is the US centered globalization. It's the old colonial economics system under a new name. But nevertheless, it was a trend that after the 1980s, there's all those countries that one after one that started to, be subjected to the U.S. economic dominance. Samir Ali, Dr. Aziz quoted, he called this the conglomerization of the national bourgeoisie. Obviously, commercialization applies to many different parts of the world, but that was a general trend. But capitalism always creates its own contradictions. It's regardless of your personal subjective feelings or theories, that the contradictions are there. Capitalism remains highly uneven, remains abusive, exploitative. But now, 40 years after the start of neoliberalism, we can see very important differences. The US as the center of that system has been declining, and there's all kinds of signs of decline. Even though in recent years the US can behave rather aggressively on the global stage, but retreating from the center, retreating from its traditional role as the world center, will create aggressiveness. So the aggressiveness of the United States should be interpreted, in my mind, not as a sign of strength, but as a sign of increasing weakness. And that is the center of the system. And the system itself is crumbling. Clearly, neoliberalism as an ideology, as a policy, as something that has been dominating the world for the last 4 decades, is dying very quickly. And the global south, or the third world, is in a very different state. If previously, in the Bandung era, the government leaders or the great revolutionary heroes, they had the idea, the spirit is with the global south. Like, well, we want to do something different. But the body, the actual economy, is tied up with the old colonial model. So the body and spirit are rather split. But today, it's very different. In terms of trade, in terms of technology, in terms of the market, global south already constitutes more than half of the global economy. And it's in all kinds of measures. The global south as a whole is becoming a new center for new areas of growth, new areas of development, rather than the West. So I think in that way, we can think about the future. A new Bandung conference, a new Bandung spirit doesn't have to be an all-inclusive agreement that deals with all of our challenges. Think about the 1955 plan. It was rather conservative, but it stresses something in common. The common thing is that all the countries suffered from colonialism and will continue to suffer the institutions, all the legacies from that colonialism, or the newly created ones. And that is the largest commonality among all the nations, and we can still continue to build on that. Let me just mention one thing before I finish, even all the names, Asia, Africa, Latin America, these were all names given by Europeans. We didn't know we were Asians, but we were told that we were Asian. But that is fine. The names that they gave us, we would reuse them. We use them in a meaningful way. The same is with the BRICS. With Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. What does it mean? It means nothing. It was an acronym invented by Goldman Sachs analysts. So it was just handy. But eventually, the BRICS acronym would take on a new meaning. It has its own life, and people reinvent it. And we take it seriously, and we create all kinds of institutions based on BRICS. And that helps the energy, the innovation, the vitality of the global south, and we can make things done. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zurun. I love that, the idea of reclaiming the language into something that we